All right, who's here for the Dangers of Compounding Pharmacies panel? All right. All right. And not just the dangers, proposed solutions, right? We want to have solutions. So I'm Ariél. We're going to dive right into it. And
Come on up. Sorry, trying to move them up. Good.
Come on up. We won't bite, but we might, learn something today. I'm hoping to learn something today. So we're going to have, I expect, a very interesting panel here. And we're very lucky to have Christopher Tees, the CEO and founder of CAD Therapeutics, as well as Lane Kilpatrick. He's the owner and operator of Mount Olympus Compounding. And you both have a lot of experience, and you're coming at the issue of compounding pharmacies from, complementary but different perspectives. So, to kick us off, could you both briefly introduce yourself and provide a snapshot of your experience in the field? And then tie it into the intro, if you will. I'm just curious to frame how prevalent is compounding pharmacy, or are compounding pharmacies in the current healthcare landscape. So, do you want to kick it off, Lane?
Sure, yeah. You'd find in any big city, a dozen or so small compounding pharmacies. So, and across the country, where we're a little bit of a vanishing breed, though, because the FDA seems to want to really tighten control on us. There's an ever-increasing list of things we cannot compound or are prohibited from compounding. But I think there will always be a place for compounding pharmacies because we are the freedom that a practitioner has to do what he wants to do and pursue his creative, critical thinking that he has been taught to use, and often those things are not available, especially for people that think outside the box and they're innovative. So if they climb that mountain and want to plant their flag in this rarefied air where not too many other people are, they're going to need a pharmacy partner to do those things for them, get their patients what they need. So it's a tough thing because something really weird happened in 2020 that I never thought I'd see in my lifetime. It was dangerous and it was scary, and it wasn't a virulent strain of a coronavirus. Actually, what it was the government's response to it. And it scared me because they stepped in, and in the name of a state of emergency, they took away that authority of these prescribers and actually told them what they could and couldn't prescribe. And that, to me, is dangerous. Compounding pharmacies also, by the same token, need to have that freedom to put things together that are not commercially available. And you do not want to see that go away, I promise you, especially this crowd here, people that think outside the box. It's important.
Thank you, Lane. So, Chris, let's hear a little intro from you and a little overview.
Great.
Yeah,
I'm Christopher Tees. I'm the CEO of CAD Therapeutics.
Bring your mic closer to your mouth.
We are a candidate for a 505(b)(2) pathway for treatment of PTSD using combination of bupivacaine and clonidine as an injectate into the C3, C6 of the neck. It's called stellate ganglion block. We are in clinical studies with Harvard and MGH right now, going into phase 3 with hopefully fast track approval in Q1, Q2 of 2024. The big picture for us, and the reason we're sitting here with Ariél and Lane, is as part of our process of going through the clinicals, we had finished a 484-person study and called onto our compounding pharmacy asking for basic information outside of this labeling, the stoppers and the formulation, et cetera. And what we found was that they were non-compliant with the FDA and subsequently were shut down by the Department of Justice. So we were forced to find others. But that little incident, Ariél, took us to saying, from being a user of a drug to actually what's in the drug, how is it made, and what are the components that are doing this, which is called essentially compounding. So the framework of where we are from being a user of a drug and relying on people like Lane initially to get the drug into format that could be commercially available is a long path. And it's one that's fraught with danger. And the reality is that when we look at the compounding industry outside of the provisions that Lane is doing for the traditional pharma, hospital, practitioner crowd, is a whole spawn of other compounding pharmacies popping up, kind of like mushrooms outside here. Within probably 10 miles of where we're sitting, there's 22 compounding pharmacies. Half of them are under investigation with the Department of Justice. So it's a very, very lucrative area to make a lot of money for the compounders, but it's also one that's fraught with danger. And quite frankly, people like Lane, who spent 30 years in the industry, who are doing really good by their patients, are being challenged with these pop-up opportunities for semaglutide and others that we can get into.
Thank you, Chris. And so when I was getting to know Lane a bit, preparing for this panel, something I appreciated is it just was very clear that not only has he spent 30 years in the space of compounding pharmacies, but he was not afraid to be critical of the problems, but then also still standing firmly in the necessary role that compounding pharmacies can play. So, I mean, Chris, you touched on this a bit, but Lane, I'll shoot this to you. So what do you think are the primary risks associated with compounding pharmacies, particularly in terms of patient safety? And then could you share any case studies or examples illustrating the dangers and, you know, in your mind, how that could have been prevented?
Sure. The compounding pharmacy space is a real temptation for people to get in and get out, right, Chris? When there's money to be made because of the difference between the manufactured product and price-wise and what can be compounded, there are laws that protect that from happening, but you know, what are you going to do? They get in and they get out. The dangers in compounding pharmacy can be those shady, bad actors. But you know what? They're everywhere, right? They're in the medical field. They're in every field you can talk about. So you don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater. There are things you can do to protect yourself as a patient or a practitioner, and questions you can ask the compounding pharmacy. For instance, you can say, can you show me a certificate of analysis on one of your, say, a recent product that you've compounded that I'm going to be getting has the same ingredient. They can say, no, I don't want to show you, but there's your answer. Anybody that is above board and cooperating with the whole idea of quality and protecting the patient is going to let you see that. They might let you take it because the formulary can be proprietary, but they'll let you look at it. Also, you can ask, how about a certificate of analysis on the ingredients that you buy, and where do you buy them from? Those are good, solid questions. These are questions that an accrediting agency will ask and make a part of their accreditation. So things like that, you can ask those questions, and if they're forthright, they will provide them to you.
That's great. Thank you. I have another question, but Chris, do you have anything to say on that before we move on?
Sure. Since 2011, there's been 17 cases of contamination reported. There's been 11 cases leading to prosecution, over 160 years in jail, especially out of Massachusetts, where 17 people died from mold. Texas recently just had another outbreak of contamination. So going to what Lane was talking about, the industry is required. It's needed. The formulations that compounding pharmacists do, like Lane, are absolutely required, either in the formulation, distribution model, in terms of maybe it's a liquid or a certain element that's needed that he can provide on a non-batch based process, meaning it's not made for the masses. It's made specifically under a script for a patient or a series of patients. So going to the root question of the strife within the compounding world is exactly as Lane said. The opportunity now is there, not unlike the pill mills during the opioid crisis from the early 2000s, for people to go out, strike themselves, go online. I get 20 ads a day for everything from ketamine to semaglutide, literally every day. And you need to know what's in it. So the second part of your question is, you need to ask about the COA, Certificate of Analysis. But how many patients actually go to their doctor and say, hey guys, what's actually in the drugs I'm making? We trust the person or the people that are making those drugs. It's a social contract with the physician that he should know or she should know better to give us the right drug. And rarely do we ask what Lane was referring to, the underlying ingredients of APIs. I doubt one person in the room knows what an API is. But on that subject, 97% of the APIs now are made out of China and India. And that's a real risk.
Active pharmaceutical ingredient, API.
Yeah, so those are words that are common within his industry, but the general people don't know. So there's been outbreaks, there's been contamination, there's been issues, there's been enforcement action, and recently there's been an outbreak around semaglutide in particular because of the spawn of Wegovy and the other drugs. So anyway.
Thank you.
The real danger lies in those injectables that are sterile, and that's where the situation in Massachusetts was so egregious. There were a lot of people killed, and to me, some of the people held to account for that should have been on the board of pharmacy of the state of Massachusetts, because that's where the authority lies to enforce the laws. And as it should be on a state level, not overreaching central statutory control of this sort of thing. Leave it to the states. That's where it's supposed to be. They're the ones that issue the licenses. They should have been monitoring that, and they were, and they failed. So sometimes the legislature's response is, we need more laws. No, maybe we need to enforce the laws that we have.
Thank you for that. So, just to take a little further, I'll shoot this to you, Chris. What does FDA approval mean with regard to compounded preparations? And, why are there more regulatory enforcement actions happening? I mean, you've touched on this, so you don't need to repeat. But I'm also curious about how this relates to the opioid crisis.
Sure. So I think it's a really good question. So if we just break down the question in two parts. First of all, what FDA regulatory approval means is that it's gone through safety, efficacy, duration. There's a number of phases of clinical studies that we know that drug and the underlying active pharmaceutical ingredients, the APIs, are sound, and that there's data that supports this scientifically. As soon as you go outside the realm of FDA, which may or may not be the total solution, but as soon as you go down road to compounding, it's the Wild West. And the reality is that the legitimate providers of compounding services provide an essential service, especially in pediatrics, cancer, and other drugs that need to be formulated a specific way. Again, either for the route of distribution or the amount or the type of preparation that's required for a specific drug. And that is, without that, we're in a huge problem. You have to balance that with Department of Justice and FDA's efforts to looking at what amounts to a tidal wave of uncensored pharmaceutical actors in the space, in the compounding space, who've glommed on to the current drug of the day. So going back to the opioid crisis, when we look at what some of the actors did in the space, including Purdue and J&J, et cetera, it's not that they did non-FDA approved drugs. That was not the issue. The drugs that they had were absolutely FDA approved. It was the method of distribution and the method, the titration that they used, saying instead of 20 milligrams, take 100. I have a migraine. Maybe I need it for back pain or something else. And these docs were writing scripts, out the door. So the fact that the FDA approved the underlying drug had nothing to do with the distribution model. What we're talking about with Lane is unregulated FDA-approved materials that are being injected, being put into the body, aerosols or otherwise, that you just don't know what's in them. And if we expand that just one level further, and certain people in the audience may or may not know this, but there's synthetic psilocybin coming on board now out of Stanford University, which is going to be a really good thing to actually know what's in the drug that you're taking. And so it's the first. Can they do it in ketamine? Absolutely. J&J is on the lead on that. So at least if you get ketamine approved from the FDA, I think it's a good step in the right direction.
Thank you. Lane, do you want to weigh in on this?
Yeah. By far, what most compounding pharmacies are compounding they're using ingredients that are FDA approved. We get the criticism all the time that this is not FDA approved, so we don't know anything about the safety, efficacy, all the things that Chris listed. Well, in most cases, well, in every case, the drugs that we, except for in the development of a new product, a new entity, these things are all FDA approved. The ingredients are. It's the final preparation that isn't. And really that kind of falls in importance when you think about it, because the drugs are approved, it's how they're put together, and those things can be tested. We know how to read a scale, just like a pharmaceutical company knows how to read a scale. And the quality things are in place, the quality processes. So that's important to know. Their FDA approval is a little bit misunderstood sometimes, I think. They don't have to be FDA approved as the final source. For instance, I compound a freeze-dried product that's a under-the-tongue dosage delivery for an FDA-approved drug that's been approved for many years, decades. So, but my little sublingual tablet is not approved, but it doesn't have to be.
Thank you. So even though the two of you are coming at this from slightly different worlds, I see that you're on the same team because you both want the best treatment for the most people. You want to help people. So, Lane, with the dangers in compounding pharmacies, I mean, the bad actors are really bad for your business, right? They make it harder for you to do what you do, what you've been doing for 30 years. So, do you have any ideas, and I'll shoot this over to you, do you have any ideas how to weed out the bad players so that it's not so easy for them to get into the game and potentially, get people addicted to things or worse?
Well, yeah, see, this falls to the state governments, as it should. There are boards of pharmacy that are commissioned by every state government, and they have the responsibility to see that those standards are upheld. There are compendial standards out there. United States Pharmacopoeia is the one that we use mainly in this country, that set forth quality details, and that is not enforceable as a compendium, but to the extent that each state adopts it and takes on those things and codifies it into their law, then it is. And what I run into often is, well, I don't know if it's often, I don't want to disrespect these state inspectors, but sometimes they come in with too little experience, and it's not a big part of their job. Most of their job is inspecting a Walgreens or a Rite Aid or CVS. They just, remember, we're 3 or 4% of total pharmacies, so they need to have that training and that knowledge and awareness so that they can enforce it and realize that it's their responsibility. They're charged with the safety of the citizens of their state, and they should take that very seriously.
Do you want to say anything on this, or should we
Covered
move
it.
on? Okay, great, awesome. Since we're at Wonderland, I think it's worth touching on psychedelics. So what's your view? You touched on this a little, Chris, but let's see if there's a bit more here. What's your view on how pharma will approach the growing psychedelic demands?
I think it could explode. I honestly believe in 3 categories. The ketamine, MDMA, and psilocybin areas are going to be heavily explored by large pharma as and really needed. The reality is that whether it's anxiety, PTSD, general anxiety, depression, or other life issues that are caused by trauma or other events, there needs to be something other than SSRIs. SSRIs, selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors, which are the general pharma prescription that your doc gives you as first round. So the reality is that if we can get away from the pharma approach, direct pharma approach, and selective reuptake inhibitors into other areas, there's potential therapy that's added. And people are really at a point, given that we have, whether it's the crisis with COVID-19, or whether it's general discord and war, or other social disruptions, At no point in the United States history do we have numbers that are so widely and disparate around mental disorder and mental health, and we shouldn't use the word disorder, mental injuries. So some numbers are reported that 50% of the US population suffers from some level of anxiety, depression. Well, even if that number is 30%, you look at 90 million people. It's an enormous problem that a large pharma is trying to attack by the same type of drugs they've used for the last 40 years, quite frankly. So to the extent that there are other therapies or other remedies or other things that work for people, I'm all for it. And I think that we need alternative models, because not everything works for everyone, is a reality. So I think in net is that large pharma is starting to approach very aggressively, especially in ketamine and psilocybin, areas that they could regulate, modulate, and find the underlying APIs for, that's going to explode in popularity as we go forward.
Thank you. Lane, do you want to weigh in on this?
Ketamine, from what I gathered this is kind of new to me, the psychedelic space, but ketamine is the only FDA-approved product, to my knowledge, that really can be used at this point. So it's a good example because, and it's not commercially available. So I mean, this is something that has got to be compounded. And when it is, it's important that the pharmacist understand thoroughly exactly what this drug does, what its risks are, and that's a little bit weak, I will admit, in compounding pharmacy. The consultation needs to be stronger, because there are potential adverse reactions that can take place on an initial dosing of ketamine. Patient needs to know and understand those things, and I always ask, you're going to be with your practitioner with this first dose, right? I think it's important that they are physically with them or that there's live video, because these things need to be identified if they're seen. So there's that clinical side too that's really important in compounding.
I appreciate that, and I recall you saying something about you've even refused to fill scripts before. Or would you say a little more on that?
Yeah, I have. If the dosing is inappropriate, we have in pharmacy, we have corresponding liability with the prescriber. If something goes wrong, I'm going to be named in that lawsuit, I promise you. I'll be right up there having to defend myself along with the prescriber. So when I have a question, I don't take too well to a practitioner not wanting to talk to me. So what option do I have? I can't fill this for you. And this is the reason why. Your practitioner won't communicate on it, or I don't feel comfortable. But I always give my reasons. And if I don't have a reason, if I just don't know enough about it, well, I guess that's a reason, but you better disclose it. You better say that you don't know. That's one of the things that's really lacking in medicine. Not too many people are strong enough to say, I don't know.
Thank you for that.
And I think it does take strength of character to say that.
Absolutely. And it also, it requires care and actually wanting to help people. And I think it also requires long-term thinking, where it's not just about this quick buck, but it's more about a long-term mission to help people, and also a long-term business. Because I think in terms of the long-term, Lane, you're going to stand out. You've been doing it a long time. You'll keep doing it a long time. And a question I have, because you were talking about the state-level oversight and how important that is, but I'm curious, what are both of your ideas on what could be done kind of at the peer-to-peer level and then also at the education level? So, I mean, educating the public. And I guess the second part of the question is, could there be a place for kind of like the GMO certification? That was created by people who care about the GMO issue. It's not sanctioned by the government or anything, but it's now a trusted accreditation and badge. Could there be something like that where guys like you get together and create some sort of gold standard created by good players in the space that the bad players just aren't going to live up to?
So the good badge, bad badge opportunity is definitely there, but it's not going to happen during, unfortunately, Lane, my lifetime. The thread of regulatory governance at a state, right, and federal level is so tight that they're not going to move left or right. However, that being said, what happens anytime you put someone in a corner is they find solutions. So they either go to Mexico or Europe and so forth. So to the extent that there needs to be a solution of good practitioners like Lane and his team versus the bad actors, it's very difficult for a consumer to know who's who. And I think that's what you're getting at. So to the extent that there's named or identified people that have good practices, GMP is good manufacturing practices. There's very few compounding pharmacies that have it, actually less than 2% have that certification. And there's not one compounding pharmacy with CGMP in the space in the United States as of today. CGMP is the clinical side of this, meaning current good manufacturing practices. That doesn't mean that they're bad. And that's the interesting thing, is good manufacturing practices is one thing. But the adverse to that is that means if Lane doesn't have that certification, does it mean he's doing it bad? The answer is no. From a consumer, even hearing these terms is not unlike when we first started talking about COVID and about some of the injectable space and about what the issues are about approval, about getting this drug approved, et cetera, at this time. This is the challenge that good compounding pharmas are facing every day. But in the space of, if we looked at a specific segment of pediatrics and cancer, these people are the angels of the world. They're not pushing the fast buck, they're fixing people who are sick. And that's the bottom line.
Thank you. Lane?
Yeah, it's important to understand that distinction. When he says good manufacturing, was it GMP? But what's the P? Practices. Good manufacturing practices. It doesn't mean that because you can do quality work on a smaller scale. GMP is a standard that manufacturers are held to that do this en masse, a lot of them. And frankly, if that were imposed on compounding pharmacies in the community, 90% of them would be out of business. It's just too expensive. It doesn't mean it can't still be a quality process and standard operating procedures that are accepted and that the state reviews. Now, to your question, there are private accreditation agencies that are out there. They're also quite expensive to get that accreditation. Do you need it? I've gone through spaces of time when I have had it and other times when I have not. I don't think it's necessary. As if you're doing those things what they do essentially is they look at all of the compendial standards and good standard operating procedures, good best practices. You don't need them really to do it, but it is something that can be a help to consumers. So,
Thank you both so much. So we're just in our final moment here. Any, like a 30-second closing thought?
Yeah, I think, Ariel, thanks, first of all, for putting this panel together. I think the big picture is buyer beware, and that's in a lot of things, but particularly in this particular space, in the manufacturing of drugs and compounding space, it's time to get a little bit smarter about what we're putting in our bodies, and to the extent that we can increase that knowledge level, that's why we're here. And from a regulatory perspective, it's not going to get easier, but maybe people get smarter how they approach the market.
compounding pharmacists, know your limitations, don't exceed them, don't do more than you should be doing, and do it the right way. Practitioners, you need us. Support your local compounding pharmacist because he is where the rubber meets the road. You need your patient to have something, you got to have somebody that can deliver.
Thank you both so much.
Thank you.
Thank you, panelists.